So now we're getting breaking news coming in from the UN Human Rights Commission meeting, which is going on. There's a meeting on a resolution against Sri Lanka. We're hearing that India has said it will abstain from voting in this particular case. The resolution, of course, targeting Sri Lanka on its human rights abuses, particularly against the Tamil minority in the northeast of the country. Remember, India has voted against Sri Lanka at least twice before this time choosing to abstain in the vote. We also know that Pakistan had spoken earlier. Pakistan had said that it would reject the resolution against Sri Lanka. Gaurav Sawant joins us for more on this story. Gaurav, what's behind India's seeming change of mood on this particular resolution?
India has made it very clear that this resolution is different from the resolutions that came in the past. India says this is intrusive mechanism that is coming into this resolution, and this will impact the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Sri Lanka, and that is something that India just cannot accept, and that is why India will abstain on this issue. If I could bring in what my sources have just said, India is voting differently on this resolution because it's different from earlier resolutions of 2009, 12 and 13. This resolution imposes an international investigative mechanism. This is an intrusive approach that undermines Sri Lanka's sovereignty, and this is unacceptable.
Now the interesting thing, Gaurav, is that India could have voted against or rather, it could have voted against the resolution or in favor of Sri Lanka, but it chose to abstain on this particular point. That's a statement to Colombo saying, look, we're particular about sovereignty and infringing on sovereignty, but we still want to send a message to you.
You're spot on there. And for India, this is a tightrope walk because Sri Lanka is not just a neighbor, but also a strategic partner in not just the war on terror, but in this entire region. India needs Sri Lanka as much as Sri Lanka needs India. India at the same time cannot antagonize the Tamil population in Sri Lanka and in India. So it's a tightrope walk. You wouldn't want Sri Lanka walking into either China's arms or Pakistan's arms. So you have to be very, very careful given the fact the kind of aid that China is offering, the kind of efforts China is making in Sri Lanka, and the fact that Pakistan is openly wooing Sri Lanka. Tightrope walk for India, but India says Sri Lanka has done quite a bit, needs to do more, but we shall abstain for now.
And Gaurav, on this particular point, and one of the reasons that I'm going to read it off our feed over here, it says the resolution is inconsistent and impractical in asking Sri Lanka and the UNHRC to do an investigation simultaneously. However, Sri Lanka needs to do more on devolution and full implementation of 13A of the Constitution in basically giving more rights to Tamils.
Absolutely. Free and fair elections, devolution of power, that is something that India has been insisting on right throughout. But this is not the way forward. This is India's considered stand. You cannot have international investigations. You cannot have intrusive investigations into another country. That is something that India is very clear about. India does not want to antagonize the situation at this point of time, the Sri Lankan establishment. What is India saying? That the international effort should be to enable Sri Lanka to investigate these allegations of rights violations through a very comprehensive, independent and credible national mechanism. They do not want an international mechanism. There has to be a transparent, credible national mechanism, and that is the way forward, not an international rights body that is coming in.
Maha Siddiqui reports in India's Ministry of External Affairs and joins us on the phone line right now. Maha, some of the considerations behind India's decision at the UNHRC, help our viewers understand that.
Well, the basic consideration this time why India has abstained from voting, unlike the resolutions in 2009, 2012 and 13, India feels that this resolution imposes an international investigative mechanism which it feels is an intrusive approach that undermines national sovereignty. That is one of the basic reasons why this time India has chosen to abstain from voting. In fact, India also, and government sources are telling us that as a close neighbor of Sri Lanka, India cannot remain untouched by developments in Sri Lanka. However, the best possible way to get Sri Lanka to act upon it is by continuously engaging with them bilaterally rather than imposing any sort of an intrusive investigative mechanism on them.
All right, Maha, stay with us. Meenakshi Ganguly, who's the South Asia Director for Human Rights Watch, is on the phone line as well. Meenakshi, are you disappointed by New Delhi's stand? It seems to have put up this technicality of a dual investigation mechanism as the reason for abstention.
Yes, it is a bit disappointing because India has been quite anxious to ensure that there is lasting reconciliation and peace in Sri Lanka. And unfortunately, what we have seen in recent times is that the Sri Lankan government has not acted on the previous resolutions, which is why a stronger resolution was proposed this time. India is aware and has actually said so in the statement that there are still severe shortcomings in Sri Lanka's progress in addressing accountability and reconciliation. We would have preferred that India voted in favor of the resolution to send the message that New Delhi cares about justice for everybody in Sri Lanka.
Meenakshi, my colleague Gaurav Sawant has a question for you. I'm going to turn it over to him.
Sure.
Meenakshi, what is the inconsistency in India's stand? India also protecting her national interest at this stage. You cannot afford to antagonize Sri Lanka completely and push Sri Lanka into either China or Pakistan's arms. Would you buy that argument?
It is up to every country to decide on who their friends are. If Sri Lanka chooses to be friends with China or Pakistan, that is Sri Lanka's decision and that of China and Pakistan. As far as India is concerned, India stands by a certain set of principles. It has had a long and very detailed exchange with Sri Lanka. The reconstruction efforts that the permanent representative mentioned has been very, very significant. There are housing projects. There are the reconstruction efforts that India has embarked upon, and India's concerns have been very, very legitimate, because the problem is, as we saw recently, Sri Lanka continues to ignore anybody that talks about accountability and suggest that they are therefore LTTE supporters. They arrested Ruki and Father Praveen just recently and kept them in detention for 2 days. This is the kind of thing that Sri Lanka is doing now, and this is going to have a serious impact on how activists in Sri Lanka are going to approach accountability issues and ensure justice. At the end of the day, India's motive is very clear. India wants a peaceful neighbor. And for peaceful neighbor, there has to be genuine reconciliation. And for genuine reconciliation, Sri Lankan government has to show that it has the intention to provide accountability. Until now, we have not seen any such sign from Sri Lanka.
I'm wondering if there's something else at play over here also, Meenakshi, because one of the points that New Delhi brought up at this vote is that there could be a violation of Sri Lanka's sovereignty. And we've heard this argument previously when there were votes about the status of Jammu and Kashmir and accusations against Indian forces in Jammu and Kashmir, where India has been very vociferous against such resolutions.
Yes, well, the thing is that, one of the countries, I think it might have been Pakistan, mentioned that the sponsors have their own abusive records, which of course they do. We have as Human Rights Watch, have often commented upon abuses committed by U.S. forces and the NATO forces. That said, every country has its own problems, and we would prefer that those countries address the human rights situations domestically. India faces a lot of pressure from its own activists and internationally to address human rights problems within Indian borders. The concern here with Sri Lanka is that Sri Lanka ignored 2 resolutions. Sri Lanka refused to acknowledge that there has been no progress on accountability. What is more, Sri Lanka then proceeded to start intimidating journalists, silencing the media, arresting activists, and basically trying to silence any sort of call for justice. Now, in that situation, there is a responsibility for the international community to do more. But of course, in a perfect situation, India is right. There should be domestic efforts.
To be fair, also, New Delhi did mention that in his statement. The ambassador, the permanent representative of the UN, did say that we haven't seen any devolution of powers. We haven't seen any action under Article 13A. And that's why we're abstaining. We're not voting against the resolution, but we are abstaining because we still want Colombo to know that we're unhappy with that progress, something that you mentioned yourself a few moments ago.
No, that is true, and I think that what we've heard from New Delhi has been this kind of concern, and we hope that even though India has chosen to abstain at the resolution, it will keep that strong message going with Colombo, and will ensure that Colombo will take advantage of the fact that India has abstained, and will therefore listen to India and pay heed to India's concerns about the human rights situation in Sri Lanka.
Meenakshi Ganguly of Human Rights Watch, many thanks for sharing your perspectives on this breaking story. Gaurav, if I can come back to you on this story, because again, you were talking about this tightrope walk between that India has to do on Sri Lanka. On the one hand, it wants to make sure that the Tamil parties are satisfied, but on the other, it doesn't want to let Sri Lanka go away into China or Pakistan's arms. It's domestic politics in election time. Never easy to do that.
Never easy to do that, and India has consistently taken a line here. What is it that India is saying? India is saying that the Sri Lankan Tamils deserve their rights, they deserve the power they should get as per the constitution in Sri Lanka. Now, India is insisting that Sri Lanka gives them the power, gives them equal rights, their elections, that their free, fair power is given to them. At the same time, the allegations of human rights violations, they're extremely serious. Investigations by Sri Lankan government or whichever authority or mechanism in Sri Lanka carries out these investigations, they should be free, fair, impartial, credible and transparent. Should they be done by somebody within Sri Lanka or an external agency? India clearly says it has to be a national Sri Lankan organization, not an intrusive international organization.
Gaurav, stay with us. Maha Siddiqui joins us from our newsroom. Maha, the Indian Ministry of External Affairs walking a tightrope, but it certainly would have at least consulted or taken some sort of word from Chennai, from Ms. Jayalalitha over there about before going ahead and abstaining here. Would that be the usual practice?
Well, Pierre, last time around in 2013, we had seen intense pressure on the government of India to vote against Sri Lanka, that is, vote in favor of the US resolution. Even at that time, India was in a very tight spot, and they had in fact, as we are given to believe, there was an attempt by India to water down the resolution in 2013, and it's only after that that India had voted against Sri Lanka. But this time around, what India believes is that the resolution and the words were very harsh, that an intrusive independent probe into another country's into a country's internal affairs would be counterproductive, is how government sources are putting it out for us. Now, we do understand that because there are huge sentiments down south, there is a process of consultation. However, at the national level, India has also been in touch with Sri Lanka. Remember, the Prime Minister met Mahinda Rajapaksa in Myanmar ahead of the UNHRC vote. This matter did come up at that time between the two sides, and at that time India had very clearly told Sri Lanka that it has just received the draft resolution but had promised to stay in touch with Sri Lanka over it. So it is very clear that India has stayed in touch with Sri Lanka, and at the end of it all, it has felt that it cannot vote in favor of the US resolution because of the fact that it calls for an independent international probe, and therefore India has decided to abstain from voting.
All right, let's actually get a perspective from what's going on in Chennai. Priyambada, our correspondent, is with us on the phone line. Priyambada, any reactions yet from the AIADMK government?
Well, it's not just about the AIADMK government. So far, we haven't got an official reaction, but all the political parties here in Tamil Nadu, as such, they had given up on the resolution because they feel it's a very watered-down resolution. And number two, last two times, in fact, there was allied pressure for the Indian government, for the UPA government from the DMK, which threatened to walk out of the government. So that's the reason why India was in a way forced to vote against Sri Lanka, because all along India had been defending Sri Lanka. So far, the political reactions are coming in. In fact, in the last 2-3 days, various political leaders here in Tamil Nadu have commented about how they are guessing that Indian government is likely to vote for Sri Lanka, not vote against Sri Lanka. So they already know the fact. But there's going to be a small difference this time. Unlike last two times, where there were immense protests happening across Tamil Nadu, and also it was politicized to a large extent, this time around it's slightly different. We haven't seen many protests happening. Of course, it's election season. definitely one more pointer for every political party, be it ADMK, DMK or DMDK or NDMK for that matter. All of them are going to take up this issue and point fingers at the Congress leaders who are contesting here in Tamil Nadu, which as such is a difficult process for them considering the fishermen issue and various other issues which is working against them.
Yeah, Priyambada, many thanks for that perspective from Chennai. Gaurav, I want to come to you on this because you also do our show Political Buzz today. There's plenty of talk about Tamil Nadu and how the Congress has failed to form an alliance over there. That would certainly be playing on the minds of the government's leaders. Actually, I'm being told that N. Ram, the editor of the Hindu newspaper, is on the phone line with us. Sir, your reaction to this abstention?
Pardon?
Your reaction to this abstention by India on the vote against Sri Lanka?
I think this is a decision that has been taken independently on merit, not under pressure from some political factor or alliance in Tamil Nadu. And I think it's a well-considered decision because to have gone along with it would have implications for India's own position on Kashmir and so on. And also, I think there's no problem because I think there is a need to investigate seriously, far more seriously than has been done so far, the alleged war crimes. But it has to be an internal process. And that's what you would have expected India to support. And so I think that's the right way to go. So we don't, this is consistent with India's policy that an external intervention should be avoided. It deviated from that policy under pressure on earlier occasions. Now it's returned to this. But obviously because, one of the reasons is the Congress party is completely isolated in Tamil Nadu, has no alliance nothing to lose, and there's no alliance to look over its shoulder at. So I think this is a decision made on merits, and that's what it is.
You were talking about the decision made on merits. There was no political pressure this time. In some ways, was it easier by the fact that the Congress doesn't have an alliance, or do you think this could very well change in a post-election scenario where the government, where either party is trying to form a government?
I don't think the Congress is out of the picture because I think all the polls show that the Congress is completely out of the race. So it will try to get over 100. That's what the opinion polls suggest. Its aim is to be a fairly serious opposition.
Let's look at it from the
get the
BJP's
numbers.
perspective,
Therefore,
sir.
It doesn't affect relieved and liberated from the pressure of having to cobble together a government. And that's what it is.
What about from the BJP's perspective? Could this be difficult for the BJP to take a stand on Sri Lanka?
Yes, it would, because if the BJP, which is not expected to get anywhere close to 272, and surely would have to depend on several MPs from Tamil Nadu, if Mr. Modi succeeds in forming the government, and that's the big if. Then the BJP will be obliged. It will come under the same kind of pressure that the Manmohan Singh government came under.
Mr. Ram, thank you very much. Apologies, you wanted to say something?
I think it will come under even greater pressure because the Manmohan Singh government had better numbers after 2009 than the BJP is expected to have in 2014.
All right, thank you very much, sir. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. And I want to go on that note to Gaurav again, because we were about to come to you on the political question, and an interesting point over there made by Mr. Ram that the BJP would be even under more pressure now to go soft in some ways and accede to concerns of Tamil parties than the Congress.
Well, as always, N. Ram has hit the nail on its head. But that's a situation. I would think when you reach the bridge, you cross it. For the moment, as N. Ram rightly pointed out, lucky for India, Congress is in no alliance with anyone in Tamil Nadu. So this is a decision that has been taken in national interest. You don't have to rely on either DMK or AIA-DMK, because as far as the political buzz is concerned, the AIA-DMK has promised an elam in Sri Lanka in its election manifesto. It has said that it will strive for a separate Tamil elam for Sri Lankan Tamils, for greater rights, for greater autonomy, separate elam for them, and take this issue to the UN. So, had the AIA-DMK been in alliance with the Congress, this perhaps decision would have been extremely difficult because of DMK pressure. Sources in Ministry of External Affairs tell us that P. Chidambaram for the 2013 resolution put a lot of pressure on Salman Khurshid and the External Affairs Ministry, and of course ultimately the Prime Minister, because it's the Prime Minister's call to vote a certain way on the resolution.
And in some ways, as Mr. Ram was saying, it becomes even harder because you have some pretty radical parties. Well, you wouldn't call them radical in many senses, but politically extremely radical parties on this Tamil Eelam issue.
Oh, absolutely. There's multi-party alliance that the BJP has got into in Tamil Nadu would, as Mr. Enram was pointing out, if the BJP is nowhere close to 272, it will need, the NDA will need support of allies. And the problem that Dr. Manmohan Singh faced, let's say with Mamata Banerjee in Bengal, with the Teesta Water Accord, with that accord with Bangladesh, you could face similar problems or worse in the times to come. And that is why, while there was a lot of demand to insulate foreign policy from regional politics, clearly we've seen in the past 5 years that's easier said than done, and in these changing times clearly not possible.
Ma, if I can come to you on this story as well, because as you mentioned, you were in Myanmar when the Prime Minister met the Sri Lankan President. Give our viewers a sense or deeper sense of what happened in that conversation.
Well, in that conversation, this matter of the voting at UNHRC was brought up. However, at that point, India had just received the draft resolution, and India told Sri Lanka that it hasn't been able to go through the draft resolution. Hence, it will not be able to give it a concrete assurance on which way it will go at the UNHRC voting. However, India had made a commitment that it will stay in touch with Sri Lanka over the issue, and that commitment has been kept in some way to understand the situation. Now, from what the feelers that we had been getting over the last couple of weeks was that India believes quite firmly that engaging with the country rather than antagonizing it would be the best way to achieve what India believes is rightfully what the Tamils in Sri Lanka deserve. And they felt that it was because of an approach, of a friendly approach rather, that India had been able to coax and get the Northern Province elections done. And therefore, India does believe that engaging with them rather than antagonizing them, especially at an international forum, was the best way out. And therefore, when this draft resolution was brought before India, which clearly mentioned an international probe, which India felt would be intrusive as far as the internal affairs of a country go, it decided to abstain from voting because the words and the wordings of this resolution were very different from the last 3 times. In fact, the last time around, India was under intense pressure from Tamil parties to vote against Sri Lanka. Now, last time around, because that was the pressure and because there were political constraints of the UPA government, therefore it had helped get the resolution watered down and therefore had voted against Sri Lanka. But this time around, things were very different, Pierre, and that is why we have seen India abstain.
Yeah, in fact, we're just getting a readout from India, from the Ministry of External Affairs. It says the way in which the actions of the international civil servants, in this case the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, was related to sovereign states, are sought to be defined, goes well beyond the current understanding and basic operative principles of the Human Rights Council. By doing this, a resolution seeks to expand the scope of the mandate and the way in which the Human Rights Council deals with member states in the future. So, we were talking, Gaurav, earlier about that point about Jammu and Kashmir as well. That would have also been at the back of India's mind in the future, as it mentions over here.
Absolutely. Every call India takes on intrusive diplomacy, India has not just Jammu and Kashmir, but situation that could arise in future in mind. You have hostile neighbors, you have elements that are hostile to you, and they could take advantage of such a situation. And once India votes one way, you cannot change your vote. So that is why, whether it's Syria or what happened in Libya, India always votes in a certain way. Any operation, any international authority has to be through the United Nations, and even through the United Nations, India is never in favor of an intrusive international investigative or any other mechanism. Also, any peacekeeping force can only be of the United Nations and no other, not a NATO force, not an international security assistance force or any other such intrusive force. India always says operate through the United Nations, and in this case India making it very clear this has to be a national, credible, transparent mechanism within Sri Lanka and not an international mechanism.
And we were talking, Maha, about the kind of work India is doing in Sri Lanka, particularly in the Tamil province in the northeast. A lot of reconstructive work, a lot of humanitarian aid as well.
Well, absolutely. Houses are being built, Pierre, as you know, for people who were rendered homeless. In fact, India has been taking a very close look at who is being given those places to stay, and it has been working very closely with Sri Lanka over it. And India does feel that all that will be scuttled if India takes a very strong position against Sri Lanka. It believes that engaging with Sri Lanka is the only way out to get for the Tamils in Sri Lanka what they rightly deserve, and therefore it has taken this line. Also, as Gaurav was pointing out earlier, that it has been on India's mind that antagonizing Sri Lanka would mean that it goes closer to China and Pakistan, something that India cannot afford at this time. Last time around, there were political constraints, as we were pointing out. Parliament was in session when the vote was on, and it was a very difficult situation for India at that time, with the Tamil parties up in arms against the government and pressuring it to vote against Sri Lanka. Now, at that time, India found a way out, got the words watered down, the resolution by US watered down rather. This time around, those political constraints no longer remain, and India could play out its diplomacy as it actually felt would be the right way forward for a country in engaging with a neighboring country, that is Sri Lanka. And therefore India believed that getting rehabilitation, getting Sri Lanka to devolve more power, all that is only possible, and them living to the commitment of the 13th Amendment will only be possible if there is a friendly approach.
The decision taken in the national interest this time, and not in the political interest. And Gaurav, that's something I want to come back to. When we talk about the political interests over here, the Congress, as we said, have no allies in Tamil Nadu at the moment. How does this affect a post-election scenario for the Congress government when it's trying to deny the BJP the numbers to reach 272?
A post-election scenario, of course, Paya, only a psephologist or can tell you who gets what, or somebody who look into the future and tell you, but it all depends on the numbers game. How close is which party to that magic figure of 272 plus? As N. Ram was saying, BJP not coming close to 272, but the Congress is not in the game. So in that situation, well, Tamil parties will have a major role to play, and so will parties in Bengal or Andhra Pradesh and so on, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar. It all depends on the swing states. But as far as India's foreign policy is concerned, Bengal and Tamil Nadu have a major say there. And clearly India's foreign policy to a large extent vis-a-vis Bangladesh and vis-a-vis Sri Lanka, the regional parties will continue to have a bigger say than the moment. It all depends on which alliance, the UP or the NDA, has more numbers.
All right, so there might be viewers who are just joining us, and we've sort of drifted pretty deep into the discussion over here. But just to reiterate what's been happening, there was a vote in the UN Human Rights Commission this morning, we should say, their time, where India abstained from voting. The vote was on Sri Lanka and its record in human rights, particularly concerned with the Tamil citizens of the country. India decided to abstain because it felt in this case there were some very intrusive portions of the resolution which it simply could not support. However, it also wanted to send a message to Sri Lanka, so it said it would not vote for the resolution but still abstain from it. And I want to go to Maha. For viewers who are just joining us, Maha, can you explain why India chose, or the explanation that India gave on why it chose to abstain in this case?
Well, the basic point that India has made this time around is that the resolution and the call for an independent probe is very intrusive in nature. let me tell you some of the important points that our sources are telling us, that India has chosen to vote differently this time around, because unlike the resolutions in 2009, 2012 and 13, this resolution imposes an international investigative mechanism which India thinks is an intrusive approach that undermines national sovereignty. That is the underlying fact at this point, that India believes it would be intrusive in nature and would undermine the sovereignty of a country. What India also points out is that being a close neighbor of Sri Lanka, however, India cannot remain untouched by what is happening there and what had happened there in the past towards the fag end of the civil war in Sri Lanka, because there were Tamils who were living in Sri Lanka who got affected. It says that the explanation that India really gives at this point in time is that it doesn't believe that an intrusive investigative approach would be constructive in nature, and that it is best that Sri Lanka is encouraged to actually give what is rightfully theirs to the Tamils, and therefore an intrusive investigative process would hamper that.
Maha, stay with us. Ms. E. Naganathan is a Tamil rights activist and he joins us on the phone line now. Sir, your first reactions to this news of the abstention?
Yeah, the first fact is the 8 crore Indian Tamils are being betrayed by the Indian stand. The Indian government completely violated the federal structure of this Indian setup, because in Tamil Nadu, we had a unanimous resolution being passed which reflects the sentiments of 8 crore Tamil people that we need an international independent war crime investigation, and for political solution we want a referendum. Now India goes back means, so India has been ruled by only few or 5 to 10 bureaucrats only, not taking into the aspirations of 8 crore Tamil population who are living as Indian citizens. Still, India is going to approach this approach. We people in Tamil Nadu have to take a very aggressive stand towards the center and reflect our emotions towards it. See, the entire world knows that there's a gross human rights violation, structured genocide has been happened. We had many TV interviews, TV channels depicting right from UK Channel 4, including Headlines Today, who went inside the Sri Lankan fields and gave a very vital information about the human rights violation, genocide happened there. Still, India has been insensitive. It's a very, very worrying factor for people who are working for the social cause.
Sir, my colleague Gaurav Sawant would like to have you ask you a few questions. I'm turning it over to him.
Mr. Naganathan, have you no faith that in a transparent manner the government of Sri Lanka or an independent body within Sri Lanka can carry out such an investigation in a transparent manner?
It's simple. See, for example, for lessons learned, reconciliation, LRC is a self-appointed commission. How would you expect the perpetrators of wartime and genocide to be the justice of their own? How can be judges of their own crimes? What we want is an international independent war crime investigation, and we thought India would propose a solution. As a long-standing history, right from Nehru days, we have stood for human rights violations, we have stood for the oppressed people. Now India has taken a U-turn. It indicates how the Indian bureaucracy and the Indian center are acting as stooges to the Sri Lankan government.
But, you know, having said that, sir, the Indian permanent representative did say one thing. He said that Sri Lanka has not done enough on devolution of powers to Tamils. It has not done enough to take up what was promised in the earlier two resolutions that it voted for, which went against Sri Lanka. India could have very well rejected this resolution on the grounds that it was too intrusive into a nation's sovereignty. It decided to vote in abstention because it wanted to send that message to Colombo.
No, actually, hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, it raises a strong suspicion in this situation, because why is India opposing an international independent war crime investigation? Even our hands are split with blood in the civil war? It's a question rising in the minds of 8 crore Tamil population.
Could you explain that? Could you explain that in detail?
Is that the reason? We are not. What about bringing an international independent war crime investigation? What to do with sovereignty of Sri Lanka? Could you answer that? What it has to do with the sovereignty of Sri Lanka?
What about if Pakistan proposes one for Jammu and Kashmir tomorrow?
See, Kashmir, do you think there's a genocidal war? 1.5 people have been massacred there actually, as a brutal war, which is evident. Do you have any UK Channel 4 videos depicting?
Well, we do know that Pakistan has done this in the past. They've tried to do this in the past, and India had to literally work all levers to try and prevent that resolution from passing. If you allow it in the case of Sri Lanka, you're setting a precedent, isn't it?
So, so you want to justify the abstinence of India by the brutal actions of Sri Lanka by relating issues of Kashmir and Northeast?
I'm putting the question to you because it's been asked before, so I'd like your thoughts on it.
So regarding each time we take up this issue of human rights violation regarding Sri Lanka, immediately we quote about the Northeast and Kashmir. But you see, this is an issue, it's an international issue where around the entire Tamil diaspora has been burnt out on this particular issue. About 8 crore Tamil population are sensitive about this issue. But why don't you approach as a human rights population, human rights situation? Why don't you approach as there is a success genocide happened? Everyone knows that. Everyone knows that. Cleverly planned move at the time of elections in Tamil Nadu. The bureaucracy of India cleverly played a role here where they abstained the vote.
What possibly could the government have gained from abstaining here politically? You're making the charge that the elections has something to do with this decision. What possibly could the government have gained?
No. See, when the elections are there on the ground, see, they thought the people of Tamil Nadu won't do an uprising when the elections are around. Everyone will be caught in the election fever. It is not so. So that's why the timing of this particular resolution and the abstaining plays a factor.
I put that question to you again by abstaining from this vote.
In a democracy, a country should move according to the aspirations of the people or on the reflections of people. So that's why we got a very good unanimous resolution being passed in Tamil Nadu. What happened to that resolution? Why did the centre didn't take a single bit of consideration of the Tamil Nadu resolution, which is being passed? Which reflecting sentiments of 8 crore Tamil people here.
I want to come.
So insensitive.
All right, let's understand that. Perhaps the centre said, well, we take the aspirations of, or we take the wishes of the Tamil Nadu people into consideration, but we believe they're inconsistent with the national interest. Would that then be a fair call?
Hello.
I said maybe the centre did say we take the wishes of the Tamil Nadu people into consideration based on that resolution passed in the assembly, but it's against the national interest.
Three years have been passed. So from 2009 to 2014, after the post 5 years has been passed. See, we don't want honey-coated statements, just like politicians who say around come here. We want real actions for India to be taken. We want India to be the champion for this oppressed people. But India is taking a U-turn against this particular issue. It's very disturbing for us.
All right, I want to come back again to the point you made earlier about the timing, because India has voted against Sri Lanka many times before in the past, in this particular body, on a resolution about rights for Tamils, on a resolution about investigations into Sri Lankan war crimes against Tamils. Again, I ask you, you keep questioning the timing of this. What possibly could the government have gained by voting, by abstaining from voting?
See, now I would say now Indian establishment, which is rising above the political parties, the Indian bureaucratic mode, where they find a change of guard. They are anticipating a change of guard. See, the Congress was in the center, then it was backed up by certain allies from the Tamil Nadu government, which had mounted a pressure on the government to make a political decision overriding a bureaucratic decision. That's what happened. Now, in the time of election, the bureaucratic decision have overcome the political decision.
Okay.
So it's the 10 bureaucrats are going to determine the Indian external affairs policy because they have close relations with Sri Lanka. It's a question I'm asking. Or the 8 crore population aspiration is going to reflect that.
And that
which you are going to choose.
That is a fair question, and I think that's something the Ministry of External Affairs and certainly the UPA government has to answer for. Mr. Naganathan, we appreciate you sharing your views with Headlines today. Thank you for coming on.